just going to call the July 22nd meeting of the Hingham School Committee and the Interim Superintendent Search Committee to order. My colleagues, Katie Roberts from the Screening Committee is participating remotely, as are Carlos De Silva from the School Committee, and Liza O'Reilly and I from both the School Committee and the Screening Committee are participating remotely. And we appreciate your flexibility with this. We had made other plans because we didn't have an interim superintendent search on our radar when we made vacation plans this summer, so we just appreciate that. Because it's kind of awkward, I asked Michelle Eyre, who's our vice chair, to kind of run the meeting from within the room since most people are in person. So Michelle, you can take it.
Sure. All right. Thank you so much, Carrie. Thank you, Dr. Keough, for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time, especially on this beautiful summer day, and also to all the members of the screening committee, the school committee, the staff, and the public that are here in person. Appreciate everyone taking the time. Just to give you a little setup is what we're going to do. We have 13 questions, lucky 13 questions to ask you. Each person here on the committee and the screening committee will ask a question or two. We have about an hour for you to answer the questions, and hopefully at the end we'll have maybe a minute or two if you have any questions for us. All right. So I'm going to get started. I have the honor of asking the first question. If you could tell us a little bit about your personal, educational, and professional background and how that led you to apply for this position in Hingham in particular.
Sure. I just finished my 34th year in education. I've lived in Sherburne all my life. I actually share a home with my mother. Raised my 3 daughters there, and of course my incredibly supportive wife, Chris. It's a great community. I had the opportunity in the past 4 years to go back and lead in my hometown. It's never happened there, and it makes me incredibly proud. But I'm also of that age group that came in the late 80s and had this opportunity to enter into Retirement Plus. I had no idea what I was doing. I was a kid, basically, and people said, Retirement Plus just means you'd be able to leave earlier. And so I was eligible to retire this past spring, but hopefully you'll see after today that I'm not that old, and I still have a lot left in the tank. I've always loved working with kids. That's where my passion was, obviously. I came in as a history teacher and very quickly moved into special education because at that time they were riffing teachers on a regular basis. And history is my passion still. But I also feel very strongly about working for the underrepresented. And I was an alternative ed teacher and worked with some pretty challenging kids that allowed me, though, it was a route into to stay in education, frankly. And after a time in education, I started to realize that the best way for me to impact kids, even though it would mean sacrificing my contact with them, would be to be in a leadership role. And so, kind of the rest is history. Obviously, one of the highlights was going back for my doctoral degree from Boston College, which was an amazing program. But BC shot me down as a kid. So I always tell the students, don't worry if you don't get into the school of your choice. You might get the opportunity later to return. So, but I'm here basically because I want to stay in the field. I want to continue to contribute. And I think Hingham is probably very similar to Dover, Sherburne, or other places I've worked, like Easton and Wellesley, in that these are places with very high expectations. I hold myself to very high expectations, and that feels most comfortable to me. I've worked in systems that did not have very high expectations, and it felt very uncomfortable. So I think it's a good match, but I guess we'll have to see.
I think our next question is Mary.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Keough. I'm Mary Eastwood. I'm the principal of South Elementary School. We have a very similar background. Okay. I kind of lived that life too. History teacher, then special ed.
No kidding.
So
Okay.
I think, like you said, it really broadened your horizons, and it did mine as well.
Yeah.
So, that goes to this question. What is your experience in the trenches as a teacher? So talk a little bit more about that time as a teacher and a building administrator, and discuss how this will influence the way you oversee curriculum and the promotion of excellence in teaching and learning.
Great question. Yeah, I mean, if to be completely honest, which I think is important, I'm not going to stand before you or sit before you and say and talk about my years and years of classroom experience, because it's not as much as teachers would probably prefer. I had probably 3 years in the classroom and then moved into special education. All of those, however, were in the trenches. And the only thing I can say about understanding that is that when you are the principal or assistant principal, but when you are the principal of a school, especially in places like Hingham or places like Wellesley or Dover-Sherburne, you have people who've been very successful on your team. They frequently don't necessarily feel the same urgency to change or move forward. And that was especially hard for me in Dover-Sherburne, because my children had gone through the system. I went through the system. My mother taught in the system, and I knew there were areas of need. There just were. For example, around diversity. That's just something we didn't talk about very much at Dover-Sherburne, and it needed to happen. My own children told me that when they my daughter got to UVA. I remember her saying, "Dad, I'm so ill-prepared for this diverse world that I've been put into, and I've learned so much here." And so when I went back to Dover-Sherburne, I needed to bring that to the surface, that we need to have conversations about this. And that was tough, because there were people who were insulted that I would raise that possibility. Why would I even suggest that we're not doing enough? What we did to make it clear was we asked the kids. We just asked the students. We surveyed them. And we heard a lot about their experiences, and I think it brought a lot of it back to a place that the teachers were comfortable hearing about it and the families were comfortable hearing about it. All of that said, I guess I can't speak so much to, for example, teaching in the pandemic. Teaching on Zoom in the pandemic with parents watching. I mean, that's the unimaginable. But I certainly understand it. I'm from a family of educators, and I know, I understand just through the years that I have many stakeholders, and understanding what it's like to be a teacher and to be in the classroom, and when to take off the foot off the gas and when to put it on. That just comes from experience. So that's how I would answer that. Sure.
The next question is actually from Katie Roberts, and I apologize, Dr. Keough, and to everyone. I'd forgotten to have everyone introduce themselves. So at the risk of interrupting the proceedings as we're going ahead, maybe folks can just introduce themselves to Dr. Keough so he has a sense of who you are and what perspectives you're coming from. Is that okay, Katie?
Certainly. Hi, Dr. Keough. I'm Katie Roberts, the K-12 Science Director, and I'm here at a cottage with 6 small children and 2 dogs, which is why I'll be muted for much of the proceedings today.
Good for you, though. Nice day for it. Yeah. So, fire away.
Our question was, as a member of our district's senior leadership team, which consists of principals, directors, and central office administrators. We were curious, in your role as interim superintendent, how would you build trust and ensure a high-functioning leadership team during this recovery year ahead? And in what ways might you draw on the skills and institutional knowledge of current district leaders during this interim year?
What a great question. And I don't think that there's an easy answer, because I truly believe that relationships take time to develop. But I consider myself an approachable person. I'm very honest with people. I recognize fully that a successful leader is only as good as the people around him or her. And so to come into a system like Hingham thinking that I have all the answers would really be foolhardy. So I think I would be very, very dependent on the team. And I think I would be more than likely spending as much time as I could, although there's not much, obviously, before the start of the year, but spending as much time as I could hearing from people, hearing from especially the leadership team about what's working and what isn't and what are the areas of need. I noticed, for example, that that Hingham is looking at developing a strategic plan, which is something I take a lot of pride in. I think Dover-Sherburne's strategic plan was probably the best one that I ever did. And I say I, and I use that term loosely because it was we. It was the leadership team that built that strategic plan. And it was developed over time through conversations and really honest conversations of back and forth of what's doable and what isn't, and what's practical for right now and what's a priority for right now. And that is why, honestly, that Dover-Sherburne went, for example, in one of their big buckets underneath the social emotional learning was to look at the diversity, equity, inclusion, because I was hearing from the leadership team that this is something we can do better. And I felt that too. So it makes it a lot easier to go after goals if we're all pulling in the same direction. And I think that actually took a lot of pressure off of my leaders, because they felt like instead of them having to come up with all the answers, they felt like they had strength in numbers. And by the way, the same held true for the teachers. If I was asking the teachers to do something really challenging or to push themselves in a different direction, further than they might have gone in the past, they needed assurances from me that their people would have their backs and that I would have their backs. And that was hugely important to, I think, to our success there. And so I hope I answered your question. And I'm sorry, because I went off on a bit of a tangent. Is there something that I missed there that you want more info on? Oh, great. She muted. It must be the dogs again. Okay, perfect.
Thank you. Wendy, you're up next.
Hi, Dr. Keough. I'm Wendy Rapson. I'm one of the kindergarten teachers at Foster School. My question for you is, what would you do to maintain teacher morale and to support teachers, even in the face of other pressures such as pandemic challenges, budget constraints, state mandates, increased testing, and standards?
It's another, obviously, a great question. It's one of the huge challenges for school systems right now, is that teachers are under tremendous pressure, What used to be perhaps dinner conversation has now become community conversation. So you can be viciously attacked on social media, on Nextdoor, whatever the forum. And the teachers need to know, as I said before, that I have their backs, and I do. One of the things I'm most proud of at this stage in my career is that I have some very strong core beliefs of my own. And one of my questions that I want to ask you is how you're doing as a system towards adhering to your core beliefs and insisting upon people adhering to your core beliefs as a system. Because I would imagine if you are, then your teachers aren't coming under those vicious attacks. And if they are, then the people who are doing that are really not acting as good community members, because if you're going to be respectful to each other, and I'm sure that's one of your core beliefs, I have them written here, but I don't have my good glasses on, but I'm sure being respectful is part of it. If that's going to be the expectation, it's not just of kids, the way kids treat each other or teachers treat each other, it's also how parents treat teachers and principals and superintendents and school committee members. All of that really matters. And I'm really proud of the fact that I call that stuff out. I expect people to be respectful. And I think that actually rejuvenates teachers. I think teachers they become exhausted when they feel like they're just a voice in the wilderness and nobody's listening. And I can't make the difficulties of the job go away. It's a hard job. It's a really tough job. But I can be sensitive to what's happening with teachers. I can certainly listen to teachers and their concerns. I can't, for example, say, as you know, obviously. We're just going to cut out the last week of school because I feel badly. It was a tough year, and I'd like to do that. But I have done things that I think can take pressure off of teachers. For example, we have an additional day built into the school year at Dover Sherburne, and it fell on a Monday. So that Monday in June, after what we've been through, I recommended to the school committee that we drop that Monday. It took a lot of pressure off the teachers, and it was a simple thing. It wasn't a big deal, but thankfully the school committee supported that. And it was not to say that, time on learning doesn't matter, but we were way ahead of the curve on time on learning. We had our kids back in earlier than most, and so it's little ways like that, Wendy. Acknowledging them, saying hello, not walking by them, going into their classrooms, taking time to look them in the eye and have a conversation. I think people can tell whether or not the leader's eye is pure and whether or not they are in it for the right reasons. And I think most people would say I am.
Great, thank you.
Heather, you're next.
Hi, Heather Sullivan, Double Eagle.
Big BC fan. Single Eagle, okay. So I have been teaching middle school English in Hingham for 25 years. Katie and I started the same year.
Congratulations.
We both have the big birthdays in September, too. But anyway, my question also kind of dovetails with Wendy's related to teacher morale and just the teaching, not just the teachers, actually, just I think anyone involved in education feeling kind of burnt out and, under the microscope and criticized. And how will you work with teachers to create an environment that's positive, that's encouraging, maybe if there are initiatives that you've undertaken in the past where you've worked closely with teachers and it's, brought good results. You could mention those.
Yes, for sure. Well, first and probably foremost in response to that, I don't know exactly what the struggles are for Hingham educators. I have done some surfing, but intentionally don't go too deeply into what I see or hear. I know people in the system, believe it or not, one person, a neighbor of mine, who's told me things, and I prefer to kind of take all of that with a grain of salt and hear from people directly, so that if I were to come in, I'd want to know from teachers and would open my door to teachers, to any teacher, not just the teacher leaders, but any teacher, about what's working and what isn't, or they could write to me. And on the basis of that information, I think I would be able to make better decisions on how I could support them. Are there ways we could take some of the pressure off? Are there things that we're doing that are just something we've been doing forever, but it's not necessarily needed? It's overkill. Things like that, I look for those. Again, as I said to Wendy, I can't make all of it go away. It's just a very intense profession right now with all the public scrutiny and the kind of lack of discretion that the public shows nowadays. I can't make all of that go away, but I can look for things that I think would be helpful. For example, one thing that we did at Dover Sherburne that I believe it was actually a leadership team decision. We came up with it at our summer retreat. The retreat was very helpful for the leaders. I made sure that the retreat was not a burden. I'd been, as a leader, to retreats that were a burden. I came out feeling heavier than I went in. That's not the point. Don't call it a retreat then. Call it a management meeting, because that's not a retreat. But in that retreat, we came up with this idea that we would write at least 2 of the goals for the teachers, so that when they had to do their goal setting, they could take goals that had already been written that were consistent with the district's direction. And that actually really did take a lot of pressure off of people. We're also revisiting the evaluation process, which is a huge burden at Dover Sherburne. Six visits for any NPTS teacher a year. That's a lot. It's a lot for the teacher. It's a lot for the administrators. And guess what was happening? They weren't done very well. They were basically just, cursory visits, and anyone can kind of throw language on a piece of paper and say, I met the criteria. So, yeah, we're rebooting that. We have an MOU. I'm not obviously going to be there. It got put on hold because of the pandemic, but I know that Beth, my assistant, has probably already started the work of getting that corrected. So that's meaningful ways to take pressure off of teachers. But I think the most important thing I can do is set the tone with the public about what our expectations are from people and how we treat each other.
Thank you.
I'm next. I'm Tim Dempsey. I'm a school committee member. I was laughing when Mary described a similar background. I'm a special ed teacher and a history teacher and a therapeutic alternative high school. So yeah,
There's a lot in common.
lot in common. Right. I skipped administration, went right for school committee. But just kidding.
Too, so we really do have a lot in common.
Do you have any other thoughts about the major challenges and opportunities in regard to curriculum and instruction post-pandemic, sort of as it relates to technology, but also as it relates to other areas besides technology?
Sure. I actually feel I was a little envious because it seemed to me, and I might be wrong, it seemed to me that Hingham's done a better job than Dover-Sherburne in terms of at least looking at actual data already about learning loss. And I thought we did a very good job of getting our kids back in person as quickly as we did. We had our 4-5s in December and our K3s in October, 4 days a week. So they were, and then our older kids also came in before the state. So we didn't feel as if we lost as much curriculum. We didn't feel as if we, didn't cover the content. But I noticed that you guys have actually begun to look at that and look at the data. And so I was a little, feeling a little disappointed with myself and with us in terms of that. I do think that it's critical to check the data to see where our kids are. But I always stop short with in the conversations with the school committee and with the community of saying automatically that kids have lost ground, because I live in Sherburne. I watch the kids in my neighborhood, and I've seen more kids out playing in the brook at the bottom of the street like we used to do as kids, finding ways to entertain themselves, playing kickball, something I haven't seen in ages in my neighborhood. So there were things that were happening during the pandemic that were not all bad. And so I'm not convinced that it was a complete loss. And so I think I would support efforts to investigate further so that we're making decisions if we're going to double down or backfill wherever necessary. And I do think that there would be some need for backfill, especially for our high needs students. Just want to make sure that we're not just doing it because it's the popular thing to do, but in fact we need it. So basing it on data.
I have the next question. Thank you very much. So my question is around experience with Medco programs. Hingham is privileged to have a Medco program here, and we just were curious if you have any experience with it and what you as superintendent could do to support the Medco students, the Medco families, and our Medco director and support staff.
Yes. I'm a big supporter of Medco. Obviously, as a Dover-Sherburne student, we are a Medco community, so I grew up with Medco. My children all came through the system with Medco, and actually I missed it. I missed it and didn't really understand it to the degree that I do now when I was a student. But I noticed the differences when I went to other communities that were not Medco communities, and was very pleased when I took the position in Wellesley, which was a Medco community. I went to Wellesley from Medfield High School, and Medfield is an excellent, excellent school system. I'm sure you know that. Probably competitive with Hingham. Very, very good all-around school system, but also a very white community. And I thought the kids suffered the same way my kids spoke to me about having missed out on things. I thought the kids missed out on a lot in Medco in Medfield because they did not have a Medco program, and it didn't make sense because you had Westwood neighboring Medfield, you had Dover-Sherburne neighboring Medfield, and they were both Medco communities. So Medfield could have easily jumped on, and I was always trying to convince them to do that. Lo and behold, I went to Wellesley, which had a very strong Medco program, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I know my Boston students would tell you that I was an ally and an advocate for them and for that program. And I learned so much about the experience of our Boston students and what it's like to come out to a predominantly white community. And I did some things in Wellesley that I'm really proud of. For example, when we built Wellesley High School, the former high school, which was built in 1938, is probably like this building, pretty old. And the Medco office was the home base for the Boston students. So there were 40 or 50 kids who would try and squeeze into this office, which was part of the guidance office. That was their space. And I was like, that is so not cool. And then it moved, or actually before that, it had been in the basement. So it's like, that's really wrong on many fronts. So when we built the new Wellesley High School, I can confess now because I don't work there anymore, but when we built that school, I made sure there was an extra room for swing space if we needed it, but we didn't. When we got there, we were fine, and I immediately made that the Medco space. And it was centrally located. It was a really cool room, which made it attractive to all kids, not just the Boston kids. It was right next to the cafeteria. It was awesome, and I'm super proud of that. But probably the shining moment for me was when the kids called me back when I took the job in Easton to take an award, a Medco award from, and it was definitely from the kids, which is, that's why I do this, right? So Dover-Sherburne obviously has a great Medco program too. We're trying to expand that. We listen to our Boston students. Our diversity, equity, and inclusion team that came together, which is now called DS-AID, was really prompted by Boston students, but not just Boston students, Boston and Dover and Sherburne students saying, you know what, there are things that are just not right and they need to be addressed. And we're making really strong headway. We've made tremendous progress there as a school system in support of all students of different backgrounds, not just our Boston students, but all students of different backgrounds. What troubled me about Dover-Sherburne is I've always felt like if you were different in any way, it's going to be a tough place for you. If you were socially awkward, it's going to be a tough place for you. If you're not a good athlete, it could be a tough place for you. If you're intellectually just not there, it's going to be a tough place for you. And having gone through that system and not been a stellar student, I can tell you those messages last. They last a long time, and it's tough to get out from under them. So I've kind of made it my mission throughout my career to change that. And so I think I would be a strong advocate for Medco and all of your students who are in any kind of minority status.
Great. Thank you very much.
Hi, Andrew.
John.
I'm John Ferris. I'm the Director of Business and Support Services for the district.
Hi, John.
You may be aware that Hingham is, we're participating with the MSBA for two projects at the current time. One was a core project for a new Foster Elementary School, and the other has to do with a PRS Windows project. And both of those projects in town, really, they have unanimous support, really, from all departments, the Board of Selectmen, Advisory Committee, the public. You know, votes have always been very, very positive. But my question, right, has to do with, you know, in a state of transitional leadership here, right, really important, we're building a core building, a brand-new elementary school. You know, so it has to do with that. In the state of transitional leadership, how would you lead the effort, you know, for developing the educational plan and creating the vision for the future of Hingham 10 years down the road in this transitional state, shy of a strategic plan?
That's a good question. And it crossed my mind when I was looking at kind of the job description and mentioning experience with MSBA, my big question was, well, where is Hingham in that process? So, because if you're just starting out, that's obviously a different stage and set of needs than if you're midway through something. I can only tell you that maybe I'm just a glutton for punishment, but I've been through 3 high school building projects. So, and started actually one in Easton, not a high school, but an elementary, and that building is soon to come online. But I'm familiar with the challenges that come with it, that come with working with the building committee and the town's different committees and the MSBA itself. I'm not sure how easy it would be as an interim superintendent to kind of put my stamp on it, so to speak.
So the stamp that I'm talking about is a stamp not so much of dealing with the boards and the MSBA, because I mean, we're early in the process, but we do have unanimous support for whatever project. We got a well-established school building committee, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done internally within a district to create an educational profile. Where are we going? Are we going to do the same old stuff in this brand new building, or are we going to do something different in Hingham? You know, and this is the pivotal year, right? This is the year that we're going to be developing the schematic design and figuring out, you know, what the building layout's going to be and how it's going to operate. So the challenge of the leader that comes in really is to garner all the directors and the supports and the principals and the public and whatnot, and figure out where's Hingham going in the future. So that's the point of reference of the question.
So you sort of just answered my question. But because what I would have to do is obviously bring all those people together and ask them, what's going to be critical to us? Where do we want to go? Are we going to build it just as we do now? Are we just going to listen to the architects? Are there things that we feel passionate about that we feel must be included? So in that process, for example, at Wellesley High School, which is the most current one in terms of soup to nuts, went through the entire process. As we developed that profile of who we are and what we were looking for, there were things that we knew our existing building failed at. For example, we knew that when you went to the former Wellesley High School and you entered the building, you had no idea where you were. There was an auditorium in front of you and a ramp to the right, but you really didn't know where you were. There was like no central entryway. Not only that, but the kids were going in, 15 different entrances. And this was at a time when we were talking about safety, and it wasn't safe because people were propping doors, and it was really poor. It wasn't designed for that time period. It was designed in 1930. So it didn't work. So that was one of the things that people kept saying. Can we just have like a meaningful, practical entryway? Can we just have an open space for the cafeteria that's not segregated into sections? So, for example, at the former Wellesley High School, up in the upper half of the cafeteria, there was actually a knee wall, and on the other side of that knee wall sat all our Boston students. I was like, why does that happen? And is that really what we want? And so we designed the cafeteria of the new Wellesley High School with those kinds of things in mind. We designed the classrooms in a way that was helpful to the teachers, put things in there that were helpful to the teachers. Having that open cafeteria downstairs meant those rooms above it would be inundated with noise every day at lunch period. So we built a little foyer into each classroom to buffer the noise. But a lot of that came from conversations. So as you said, with the stakeholders, the people who live it, far be it from some outsider, especially in an interim role, to come in and say, well, I really think you should do this. But I definitely have experience leading those conversations, and I think Hingham needs to build their schools for Hingham, not for their interim superintendent. So I would be all ears, but I would try to funnel it in a way that's productive for the system.
Thank you.
Can I just clarify a point? You said you were involved with 3 high school building projects. How many of those were as superintendent as opposed to principal? None, okay.
So as superintendent, it was Hopkinton, when Hopkinton built theirs, which is now getting to be an old building, in the late 90s. Medfield, when they built theirs, which was around 2004-05. Wellesley, 2012. And then Easton, their elementary school, I was the superintendent there. And we did go through the process of hiring the architects who did the analysis of the building and how it was being used and where we had space constraints. And, you put the map of the school, and all the red spots are your spaces that are not meeting the state specs. And so, but I didn't go all the way through as the superintendent.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, hi.
Hi, Liza.
I'm on the school committee. I'm in my 3rd term. I have 3 kids. 2 have graduated through the system, and my youngest one will be a senior in high school next year. So I wanted to ask you about more budget information. Hingham appropriated nearly a 9% budget increase at our last town meeting for fiscal year 22. And this budget is supported by federal ESSER funds and one-time money from the town's fund balance. The increase will result in a town-wide revenue deficit for fiscal year 23 and beyond, without an operational override to continue the supports being funded. How would you support the district through an override request that can be in sync with our currently undeveloped strategic plan?
I don't know that anyone can do that. So if I give you an answer, it's just not right. No, I'm kidding, obviously. That's a pretty difficult situation, that's for sure. This is part of the problem with the dependence by communities on the state, the federal and state aid, in that you don't want to obviously create a fiscal cliff. A 9% increase is a pretty hefty increase. I don't know that I've ever experienced a 9% increase in my career. And that's not a criticism. I'm just saying that's a big increase. And
let me clarify, our town brought up the issue of next year. There's gonna, we're gonna bring you an override request. So people have been prepped for that. This is not completely out of the blue.
right.
So if that helps you with the understanding of the situation.
It does. And so having an interim superintendent lead that process is not ideal. I think that you must know that, because he or she is going to have to convince people who he or she doesn't know, and who they don't know that person, to put their money down for the schools. So, all of this work as a superintendent especially, but as any kind of leader, is all about how effective you are at communication. So you have to break it down to people in terms that they can understand. And it's really, really hard. And I think that's just an added layer of complexity for whoever your interim superintendent is, right? Because he or she's not going to have those relationships. He or she's going to be able to communicate what the needs are, hopefully, and why you're asking. But it's still a big ask, because ultimately you get to the town meeting floor in times that are very contentious anyhow, and it's a big ask. But I guess what I would say is this: I have gone for an override and failed, honestly, in Easton. We went for an override and got it through the selectmen, and at the town meeting, it did not pass. It was close. But not surprisingly, the next year it did. And sometimes that's the way it goes. It was a tough year. People felt it had been sprung on them. You know as well as I do how you can tell people something needs to be done, and you can really publicize it, and everybody, you think, knows it by now. They would have to have lived under a rock to not know it. But then when you bring it forward on that last day, people are like, where did this come from? I never heard anything about it. And that's what I mean by the communication piece. One of the things that came out of the pandemic that I think was really helpful to me as a superintendent, because I don't think there's a superintendent alive who doesn't get dinged for communication. I really don't think that person exists. Because there's so much you're trying to communicate. One of the things that really worked for us in the pandemic was we had our Zoom meetings open to everybody. So come in here. So what I would do is I would write to people and say, we will be discussing X, Y, and Z at such and such meeting. And it's really important that you come so you're informed. And I think that was one of the huge successes for us at DS that I think other systems didn't necessarily do as well with. And maybe Hingham did too. But it was a great strategy for me to say, oh my gosh, I've got this teachable moment. I have everybody in front of me. Anyone who's ever coached youth soccer knows that, like especially, say, kindergarten age students, you get them all in the huddle. You say, okay, look, we're going to do that 1, 2, 3 team or whatever. That's your chance. That's actually your teachable moment to say, remember, we're working on passing, we're working on, teamwork, and we're working on this. Because you have everybody focused for one moment. Those Zoom meetings were that way for me, and I used that as my tool during the pandemic to say, these are the things we're doing, and this is why we're doing it. And I felt like many, many people understood. And I think I would try and do the same with something as big as, say, the override, obviously with the help of the school committee.
Thank you. Thank you. Jen?
I talked to you. My name is Jen Benham. I'm on the school committee. I have 3 kids in the middle schools, all in the secondary level. And my question is actually a good segue because it's about communication, and you just briefly talked about that. Because communication with parents and staff is vital in all public schools. One positive thing that came out of the pandemic is increased engagement from families. How would you capture the energy and interest of that stakeholder group and use it for the betterment of Hingham Public Schools? And then additionally, could you please give us some specific examples of the communication strategy, plan, and tools implemented in other districts through the central office and across the district? I mean, you kind of touched upon it.
It's a big question. So can you repeat the first section? I just want to make sure I don't miss that part.
We had increased engagement from parents
Yes,
through the
people more
pandemic.
engaged.
And how would you capture the energy and interest of this stakeholder group and use it for the betterment of the Hingham Public Schools?
Well, I would try and use some of those approaches again, things that have worked for me. For example, and this would be an example, I used Screencastify. So, and my rule of thumb was nothing more than 6 minutes, ever. I never send something out more than 6 minutes because I know people aren't going to watch it. And I always tried to stick to more like 4 or 5. But in that Screencastify, I would have my key points that I really wanted to make. If I was looking for engagement from people, I would say, for example, we're going to be sending out a survey, and it's really, really important that people participate. Like, I need everybody's participation in order for us to make good decisions for the future of the system. So this speaks to your building work as well. We need full participation. I would use those avenues and that now new engagement of people, because I knew they would watch the Screencastify because they thought they might hear something about the pandemic and reopening. So I don't know that I would have that same level of interest because people were hanging on every word because they wanted to know when the kids were going back to school. So anytime we reached out, people came on. I don't know if we would have that same success, but I don't know that we're out of the woods yet either, so they may still be paying closer attention. So these are fringe benefits of that. Now, the second half of your question was, examples of it?
The communication strategy and planning tools you've used.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I've learned about communication is this. When I was at BC, the chair of my doctoral program, Erwin Blummer, used to say, if you haven't figured it out, you just paid $75,000 to hear this is about relationship and communications. And that's the truth. And I thought that was a little bit too much sarcasm for my taste. It was a lot of money. But he was right. It really is about relationships. That would be one of the challenges for an interim. That's going to be one of your challenges for any interim who takes this position. Because relationships take time. I used to think that if you've been in a system 3 years, that's enough time to form all sorts of relationships. Au contraire. I had been in Hopkinton for 4 years. I had been in Medfield for 4 years. But I stayed in Wellesley for 7. And at the 5-year and 6-year and 7-year mark, I noticed something really interesting, which was that people were starting to trust me more. It actually took that long. So the relationships piece, he was right about that, and it takes a long time. The part about communication that I thought was so interesting was that I thought it was all about better newsletters, more newsletters, better newsletters. Not so much. It's really about how effectively, again, just as I was saying about the override, how effectively can you communicate really difficult and complex concepts in as few words as possible, because that's all you're getting. You're only getting a few words. People are on Twitter, they're on Instagram, they're on TikTok. How long is it average? What's a TikTok? A minute or something like that? 2 minutes max? So people are accustomed to just like quick snippets of information. So that's why I started using the Screencastify to say people, hey, this is my teachable moment. Hey, don't forget, we have this coming up and this coming up and this coming up. So please be on the lookout for it because it really matters. So I guess that's how I would try to use that communication. I'd obviously, again, as I said before, you're only as good as the team around you. So they kind of have to do the same thing. So reiteration is a good thing. Redundancy is a good thing if you're trying to make sure that everybody's hearing this uniform message. I'll bet you have the same problems that we did, which is School X sends out their newsletter on this date, School Y sends it out on this date, and it's like, as a parent, you're like, what am I supposed to do with all these? I don't have time to get through all these. I'd be surprised if you don't have those same kinds of challenges. So I'm not saying just bombard people. I'm saying like kind of articulated, focused communications are really critical.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, Ness Carenti. I have 3 kids in the school system. Sorry, I should stop. I'm on the school committee. I have 3 kids in the school committee, school department. One.
Very
going to back up.
talented
I'm Ness Carenti. I'm on the school committee, and my kids are not.
That's good. Protect them.
Yeah. It was interesting. I had a conversation today. My daughter, I own businesses with my husband, and she's like, you stay home, you don't get paid for work. I'm like, yeah, I'm working on your schooling right now, okay? So I have one at each level. I have an elementary school going into 5th grade. I have middle school and then an incoming freshman. So, I feel like I'm kind of everywhere right now. So I think we have all collectively experienced trauma this year, and that creates instability, from teachers, administrators, school committee members, parents, kids, everybody. And so the instability doesn't feel good. And we are headed into, our district is headed into additional instability, possibly with a new interim superintendent coming in. And people often worry about stability, and we hope to gain and not lose ground during this time. We've had a lot of change over the last couple of years. We've had a 2-year superintendent. We have 2 interim principals who are coming in. So we're again hoping that we just can move forward and not take a step back on some of the progress that we were hoping to make. As Liza mentioned, we have a 9% increase. Part of that was developing a 5-year strategic plan. And we're wondering how you might provide stability for our district while setting us up for a successful strategic plan process. And then I guess on top of that, give us an example from your career that describes how you led a community, a new community and families while dealing with change.
Great question. I think trauma is the right word. I just ran into 2 of my former school committee members, and we just had that very same conversation. It was traumatic. It was traumatizing. We are PTSD. That's what we're struggling with. And I don't think any school system, maybe in America, is immune from that. So this is a really, really difficult time to not have your leader. And that's just a statement of fact. You know that, obviously, by this question. Stabilization is, I should actually use that word in my cover letter because it's actually something that I feel I'm really good at. And that is calming the waters and letting people know basically it's going to be okay. And the way they know that is that I think what it is that I do, they say teachers have a hard time telling exactly what it is they do when they're successful. It's almost hard to articulate, and so it's hard for me to say, but I think it has something to do with the way I carry myself. I'm not a hyper person. I don't run a neck. I don't send emails out at 2 in the morning to my administrative team. I'm a fairly calm person by nature. And I think that has an effect on a system. I think it's actually benefited me tremendously. And I'm also a very respectful person. So people come to know that I'm not going to do something really disrespectful, like out somebody in some kind of public way or do something just like really harmful. I'm not going to be combative with the school committee because that has a trickle-down effect. It actually goes right down to the kids. And I said it before, the kids are my top priority. I do not want the kids to be walking around anxiously. So I set a calm tone. I try to get on the public's radar somehow. One of my strategies has been the TVP, the television production classes at Dover Sherburne, Easton, Wellesley. All 3, I used to run this thing called Keough's Corner, and that's where I would bring people up to speed on what's happening. It's like, here's what's happening. Or I used to have coffee with the principal or coffee with the superintendent. These are the things that are going on. So people they'd be calmed down. And, as far as the strategic plan goes, I noticed in your budget you allocated funds for that. The 2 strategic plans that I've done, and I'm not saying that they're the way you should go, didn't involve any outside agency. It was done by me and the leadership team. And the reason it went the way it did is this. As a principal, when I was in BC's program, one of my mentors, a guy named Jim Marini, who's been a superintendent all over the place, gave me a book called Entry by Barry Gentz. You can't even find it. And I lent it to someone and it's gone forever, which breaks my heart because it's such a good book. But it was all about how a leader enters a system and the importance of listening, just listening to people and finding out what's working and what isn't. It doesn't have to be this huge, complicated thing. So that's what I did in Medfield, and that's what I did in Wellesley. And I said to people, look what I learned in my entry meetings. when I took the superintendent's position in Easton, part of the deal was I had to participate in the new superintendent induction program. Well, what their strategy is to use the entry process that I had just been through a few times and gotten better at, use the entry process to form your strategy for moving forward. Because what you're doing is you're going through this process of looking at the data, scouring the data of what works in the system and what doesn't, having the conversations with all of the stakeholders, kids, parents, teachers, leadership team, community, selectmen, town administrators, what's working and what isn't. And through that process, they have to trust that you as a leader have, first of all, a good brain and an ability to synthesize. And what I did was, with my leadership team, I synthesized all of that information and said to them, these are clearly the areas of need. Does anyone disagree that SEL is a priority for Dover-Sherburne? Does anyone here disagree? We all feel like it's a big issue. We're concerned about our kids' mental health. This is a priority. Everyone agrees with that? Then that should be one of our big buckets. Does everyone agree that resource efficiency and how we use our resources and how we fund our schools is a priority? Everyone agreed that it was, because it is. It was basic. Another one was around instruction, like teaching and learning and that experience, and the importance of evaluation, the importance of the curriculum being current, the importance of curriculum reviews, the importance of the DEI work. All of that kind of fell under that bucket, but we all agreed that was a priority. So what I've learned along the way was that using that entry process to form your strategy, your strategic plan was key. And so we had the 5 buckets, and then we worked with the school committee's input all along the way, and anyone else, because we'd say, this is what we're thinking, what do you think? And when it was done, here was the beauty of it. Everyone's school improvement plans aligned with it. Every administrator's goals aligned with it. I can tell you, I wrote school improvement plans for school systems in April and May, and then went to the retreats in the summer to hear what the district's goals were. Like, that doesn't make any sense. That makes no sense whatsoever. So because we all developed the strategy and the kind of the key core goals and then the sub-goals, when we would bring something forward, for example, work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, professional development around that, when we would bring it forward, if somebody were to say, why are we doing this? Then I would say, were you one of the people who was under the rock? Because you can't possibly have missed this. Everybody participated. Everybody weighed in. This is a priority for the district. And frankly, if you don't want to go the way the district's going, then this might not be the right place for you, because that's the way the district's going. And that speaks to the teacher security as well, because the teachers felt more secure. They felt like, thank God I know where we're headed. So this is something that I have learned over time. And so when I think about, as the interim, how could I be helpful, that's a big question, because you're also talking about the person who's going to have the vision for the place moving forward. So do you want the person who's going to be here for a year to develop the vision for the district moving forward? And that's actually, Dover-Sherburne's in the same place, because they are now with an interim superintendent, but the strategic plan is up. It needs to be redone. And what they're doing is they're actually kicking it down the road. They have plenty to work on, but the leadership team's all pulling in the same direction, so is the school committee, so they're going to put it on hold for a year. But you're in a different place, I think.
So can I ask a follow-up question? When you did it on your own those 2 times, how long was that process for you?
The key was the summer. That was the key. And it was also the spring, right? Because I took the job both in Easton and Dover-Sherburne in, I don't know, March, April, May. And I still had to finish my current job, so I couldn't really delve into it, but I was able to start some of those meetings. For example, meetings with all of my leadership team individually took place before the school year ended, and with all the school committee or a large majority of them, before the school year ended. I just found ways to get away from my other system, and I'd pack them all into an hour and a half, and I'd go boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. And I had great notes. And then in July, I had a lot of drop-in time in my schedule for community members to come by, anyone, teachers, community members. And then in the fall, I finished it off, because that's when I had people back in, right? So the kids, all those kid meetings, again, more parent coffees. And then by like midway through the year, the leadership team and I had a really good, solid thing that we could hang fruit off of.
Okay.
So it did take some time.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. All right, I'm going to send it over to our Zoom. We're going to have Carrie and then Carlos. So Carrie, you're up.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Keough. I'm Carrie Nee. I'm the chair of the school committee, and I'm starting my 4th year right now and it's beginning my 2nd term. So my question is, could you just tell us about a major controversy or confrontation you faced during your career and how you dealt with it, and also what you learned from it?
Sure. You may have seen in the Boston Globe the article, I think yesterday, maybe even today, about Bristol Warren, and the superintendent just left because he and the school committee had as their start date the first day of Rosh Hashanah. And so September 7th is it, I think. And that created an outcry in the community, and a lot of back and forth and a lot of tension. And it was eerily familiar to me because when I was on the school committee in Easton, the school committee felt as if in an effort to be more equitable, but it was obviously controversial, and I'm not making a statement of whether it was right or wrong, but their argument was that if we're going to keep these religious holidays in the schedule as days off, then we're going to have a lot more religious holidays, because we're getting much more diverse. We're becoming more and more diverse. And so they made the decision that they were going to remove the religious holidays. So Good Friday and the Jewish holidays came out of the schedule, out of the calendar. Well, you can imagine how that went. It was controversial, to say the least. A lot of frustration, anxiety, and the way that I handled it was, again, tried to be effective in my communication. I tried to listen to people. We set up forums to make sure that people had a chance to be heard. But here's the thing about leadership. At some point, someone has to make a decision. And frankly, it's one of my frustrations in our society right now. We have issues beyond issues beyond issues. And gone are the days where somebody's willing to make a decision because they might be ridiculed or criticized or whatever. So yeah, I'm past that. I make a lot of decisions. I've made a ton of decisions that were controversial. That's just one example. Just being at Dover Sherburne, we changed the start times, so picture that. We flipped our start times. So our elementary kids are now starting at 7:50, and our high school students are starting at 8:35. That's a major shift for that place. It was controversial, to say the least. And but we made the decision based on data and research. And I 100% think it was the right decision, and I'm proud of myself for pushing that forward. When I went to Dover Sherburne, they said, well, we had a start time committee and we did all this work and everything was done, and then the superintendent was leaving, so he said, well, I don't think we should make a decision on this. So the whole thing went out the window. And basically the bottom line was a decision wasn't made. And I think that's just an injustice. And I can't live with myself like that, frankly. If you're going to ask me to be the leader, then I'm going to be the leader, and I'm going to make decisions. I'm not going to make them in isolation. I'm not going to make them wildly. But if you ask me to make decisions about something, I will. And so That was controversial. When we came back to school this year was controversial. The diversity and equity and inclusion work that we're doing is quite controversial. I could go on and on. Controversy is my middle name.
It is.
So I hope that answers.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Carlos is our last question.
The last one for the best.
Yes.
It's an easy one too. So, Dr. Keough, what would your friends say about you?
Carlos keeps saying that's an easy one. I don't think it is.
I think it's a great question. I think it's a really, really good question. I ask that question when I'm interviewing people. What would your colleagues say about you? And I think that's quite similar. I think what they'd say is that I take myself very seriously, that I'm an idealist, that I still believe that I can make a difference, and so I never stop trying. I still believe that this is much more than just going through the motions. I don't do this for a paycheck. I do it because it's good for kids and it's good for our society ultimately. I'm still one of those purists that actually believes that you have to nurture and take care of your society. And so that's what drives me, and I think people who know me know that that's true. My friends, by the way, when you say my friends, I think the people who know me best are my family. I'm so proud of my kids, and I know what my kids would say about me. And those are some of the things that they would say. I'm a passionate person, but I do take myself seriously, as I said, and sometimes to a fault, right? That can be a problem because, I believe that the best educators are sensitive, but the best educators are sensitive, right? It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, you're sensitive, so you can put yourself in other people's shoes, and that's a great quality. On the other hand, your feelings can get hurt. And when my feelings get hurt, I don't like it any more than anyone else. So that's not a strength. I think people know that about me too. So those are some of the things they'd say. They also would say I like to have a good time, which is true. I do. I enjoy my downtime. I've always insisted upon my vacations. Somebody once said to me, well, yeah, but everybody works during their vacations. Yeah, not me, because then it's not a vacation. So, that downtime is really important to me. It's how I recharge. So I'd say that some of those things, Carlos.
Great, thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
You're saying that to Zoom when everyone's zooming in from their vacation.
Shame.
Good one, Tim.
Well, you have to do what you have to do, right?
Exactly.
You also take yourself seriously, so it's obviously a balance somewhere.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. We were a little over an hour, but
I'm sorry.
No,
about
no,
that.
that is
I was
our-
running late meeting people.
no, my gosh, not at all, and
Apologize.
it's partly our fault as well. Any final thoughts or questions that you'd like for
Well, I did have a
us?
few questions, but I really am not going to go down this road too deeply because I'm pretty sure that I would learn this stuff pretty quickly if I became the superintendent.
Sure.
It is always helpful to me. It's kind of the obvious question, but I think I've surmised through this what kind of your pressing needs are, right? Construction, morale, budget. So I'm not going to ask you what your pressing needs are, but I would like to go back to that question that I asked you before about how would you score yourselves as a district, as a school community, on kind of living to your core beliefs, adhering to them, really truly adhering to them, as opposed to just putting them on paper and reading them every once in a while.
Carrie, I don't know if you want to answer that?
Well, I think you might get 7 different answers. I think we have 14 people already on the committees from that. I think it's something that we wanted to take as part of the strategic planning process. Our goal is to kind of take a hard look at those core beliefs and make sure that they're still current. I'd look at the mission statement And we are kind of just starting over the past maybe year and a half to do some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that you did at Dover Sherborne. That's, I think, important to make sure. I think our district does a really great job at educating a certain profile of student, but we're getting like fewer and fewer students in Hingham fit that profile anymore. So we want to continue to educate that group and just make sure we're doing everything we can and make sure that everybody else is included. And it feels like they're part of the Hingham Public Schools community. So I think that's sort of overall where I see the district going.
And I think that's an honest answer, and I think it's a great reason to do a strategic plan. That is probably the number one thing that you do at first, is look at your mission and look at your core values. That Erwin Blummer that I mentioned before used to talk about core values in saying that if you're not outraged when your core values are violated, then they're not core values. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah. And this, I just want to say too, this is it's one-sided interview. We're asking you a lot of questions. If you have any more questions, feel free. I think you have my email address now, and I'll send you my number too. So feel free to reach out, answer anything I will, or I can just direct it to anyone else who could. And you can also reach out to Susan Diamato too, and I know she'd be happy to connect you with any other principals or central office staff.
Perfect. The same holds true for any of you in terms of follow-up questions. I'm happy to respond. And I know that my email address is out there somewhere.
Yep. I have it there.
Yep. Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
All right, thank
much.
you,
It was
everyone.
Nice to meet you.
Yep, nice to
Time.
meet all of
Thanks
you.
for coming in.
Yep,
Really
yep.
appreciate it.
It was very good of all of you to take time out of the summer
Mm.
for your district, so
Absolutely.
thanks again.
Thank you.
Are you going to hang out, or are you?
Oh,
do you
was
know
I
where
supposed
go?
to hang
no,
out?
No, no. I just wasn't sure if you knew how to.
No,
get
I
out
know
of
my
here.
my
Okay.
way out, but was I supposed to? Susan mentioned originally perhaps meeting with members of the leadership team, but that was probably this included. They're in this.
Yes, yes,
They're in
correct.
this. Okay,
Yes.
gotcha.
So you
Great.
were good.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Very much.
Oh, is that easy? Is that easier?
Well, and you won't trip over these cords. Yes, I hear you. Thank you so much, Dr. Keough. Carrie, I'll throw it over to you to lead us out.
Yep. And we'll take some motion to adjourn the screening committee.
Bye. Thank you.
Screening committee.
Sorry, who was that?
No, sorry.
I'll make a motion to adjourn, second.
Somebody make a motion.
Jen made a motion and John seconded.
Okay. And who did?
John seconded.
Okay, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, and then I'll take a motion to adjourn the school committee.
So moved.
I'll second.
Jen? Okay, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned at 4:23. Thank you, everyone.
All right,
And
Sorry.
We will see you tomorrow morning.
All right, thanks, Carrie.
All right.
9 o'clock, right?
Get out of everybody's way.